Well, it's a privilege to be here, and I want to thank Tony for inviting me tonight. I've prepared a speech that I'm going to read. It's not something I typically do, but I want to do it tonight because I want to get it right. And the topic and the occasion calls for the right words. As Mark Twain reminds us, the difference between the almost right word and the right word, just the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. So I appreciate your indulgence. For a long time, perhaps a year or so, I've had a clipping of a William Stafford poem on my desk at home, sitting there like most poems, ignored and waiting to be read, which is obviously why I put it there in full view. So in preparing for this occasion, which involved sitting and staring at my desktop, I decided to finally read the Stafford poem, entitled The Way It Is. I must confess first a fondness for William Stafford because I had the privilege of meeting him almost 50 years ago when I was an English major at Pacific. And Stafford was on campus for a poetry reading as a favor to a friend and fellow poet, Robert Davies, who I admired as a poet and an English professor. In fact, it was Bob Davies, I called him Mr. Davies at the time, who, when I told him I was considering applying for a doctoral program in special education, he paused, looked at me with a piercing glare and said, "Be careful, there is much that is false and fashionable in that." And boy, was he ever right. In any case, so it's an interesting coincidence that the clipping of the Stafford poem, as English majors are fond to say, finally revealed itself to me as I was beginning to prepare for this particular occasion. So The Way It Is, William Stafford, by William Stafford. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. So this evening's program is about the threads that we have followed in this community. And while we hold them, we can't get lost. And as Stafford notes, although things change, time unfolds, tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and we all suffer and get old, the thread doesn't change. Importantly, as Stafford also notes, you have to explain about the thread because it's hard for others to see. So let me explain the thread that brought me unwittingly to this community 40 years ago in 1975, where I worked with Doug Carnine, Wes Becker, and Engelmann for 5 years until 1980. This same thread coerced me to return 8 years later in 1988 as a faculty member in the College of Education and kept me here for the last 27 years. So 40 years ago, when I came to the University of Oregon to pursue a master's in special education, I didn't know about this thread, or any other educational thread for that matter. Brenda Kame'enui and I had just completed a 5-year stint working first as house parents and then as teachers at a residential treatment center for young boys and girls ages 8 to 18. Identified then as seriously emotionally disturbed and removed from their homes as legal wards of the state of Wisconsin. In that experience, I learned that I could manage the disruptive and so-called seriously disturbed behavior of the young men and women in my charge. But I was personally dissatisfied with my skills as a teacher. In spite of my positive annual teacher performance evaluations, I knew tacitly that I had no clue how to teach. In fact, I didn't know how clueless I was about teaching until I enrolled in Doug Carnine's courses on direct instruction, reading, and mathematics, and the design of instruction in 1975. Those courses, coupled with courses from Barbara Maitman, were the first to introduce me to the thread of direct instruction and the simple but compelling proposition that a teacher was the causal agent in moving a child from a state of not knowing something to a state of knowing that something more fully and completely. There was no doubt in my mind that this was the thread I would follow throughout my doctoral program and for the remainder of my professional career. Importantly, as Stafford noted, the thread guided me among things that changed, but the core fibers of this thread didn't change. So let me tell you more about this thread. As with many threads in science, the thread science of direct instruction begins with a single individual, Engelmann, whose vision unyielding passion, instructional genius, and fierce determination created the thread. The direct instruction model, which is represented by a family of more than 40 commercial curriculum programs. The empirical basis for the effectiveness of these programs is represented most notably by the direct instruction model that was examined in what amounted to the largest federally funded educational research program at the time in the early 1970s, known as Project Follow-Through. Engelmann developed the fearless character, the instructional blueprint and architectural essence, and thus the core fibers of this thread. Along with his collaborators and program authors, Wes Becker, Doug Carnine, Linda Carnine, Jerry Silbert, Phyllis Haddix, Susie Hanner, Gene Osborne, Don Steely, the late Bob Dixon, and many others. He wove it all together into what can be characterized as a highly textured and almost indestructible fabric. And to extend the thread metaphor further, you wouldn't be too far off to think of this fabric as made of para-aramid thread, commonly known as Kevlar. A strong thread that is fire retardant, it doesn't melt, and resistant to solvents, mildew, aging, and abrasion. Importantly, this thread enjoys a strong thread science with deep roots in behavioral psychology, instructional design, the John Stuart Mill system of logic, and Claude Shannon information theory. According to the National Institute for Direct Instruction, or NIFTY, the thread science of direct instruction is anchored to 5 key philosophical principles. All children can be taught. All children can improve academically and in terms of self-image. All teachers can succeed if provided with adequate training and materials. Low performers and disadvantaged learners must be taught at a rate faster than typically occurs if they are to catch up with their higher performing peers. And all details of instruction must be controlled to minimize the chance of students misinterpreting the information being taught and to maximize the reinforcing effects of instruction. These principles may seem commonplace and conspicuously mundane today, but when they were first invoked and vigorously asserted as part of the direct instruction model, they were considered extraordinary and perhaps quixotic. I was inspired by these principles when I first heard Zig, Doug, and Wes speak of them. As I reflect on them now after spending more than 45 years in this field, I am still inspired by these principles because I find them incredibly courageous and as developers and implementers nothing less than fearless. Imagine a parent of a child who has struggled mightily with the symbolic system being given the following assurance. Listen, all children can be taught. Your child can be taught, and we are going to control the details of the instruction to ensure that she learns. We are not going to find fault with your child or with you. If your child fails, the fault is ours. Of course, these principles would be simply vacuous if they didn't have the technical and empirical substance to support them. Moreover, I would argue that these key principles were in many cases designed to question, if not challenge and threaten, the status quo and the traditional pedagogy that was prominent then and even now. That traditional pedagogy basically embraced the proposition that some learners will make it and some won't. That's just the way it is. To give you an idea of how the DI developers challenged the status quo, I cite 3 examples from a speech that Doug Carnine gave 2 years ago. And as Doug states, these are the myths that we faced when our work began in the late 1960s and 70s, myths that DI helped undermine and in some cases destroy. Myth number 1 involved the belief that children with Down syndrome and others with moderate retardation were simply unteachable. In the late 1960s, Linda Meyer used an early version of Distar reading to teach Down syndrome children to read. Not long thereafter, Judy Crandall and Howard Sloan transformed a special education school for children with moderate retardation into a showcase for academic success using DI, or direct instruction, reading and mathematics. Myth number 2, preschool children, especially those at risk for school failure, should not be taught academics. Zig and Carl Bereider's book, Teaching Disadvantaged Children in the Preschool, played a key role in dismantling this myth with their findings. Specifically, African-American preschoolers from families receiving aid to dependent children made average gains of over 20 IQ points and scored at the 2nd grade level on achievement measures. And finally, myth 3, African Americans are genetically inferior to whites and therefore cannot succeed in school. Doug used follow-through findings on African Americans to refute this myth in a debate with Arthur Jensen. And many of you will remember that Arthur was identified as one of the 50 most prominent, eminent psychologists in the 20th century, authored over 400 articles. But he believed in race-based intelligence and that general cognitive ability was essentially an inherited trait, determined predominantly by genetic factors rather than the environment. Dr. Jensen was whisked out of the auditorium following the debate with Doug to a backstage elevator so that protesters could not get to him. DI's role in destroying this myth gained national attention through the network program Primetime Live, which was similar to 60 Minutes. The program reported on an all-black school serving a housing project in Houston. Jerry Silbert worked extensively with the school and its principal, Thaddeus Lott. In fact, the school was so successful that Mr. Lott was accused of cheating because the central administration was convinced that black children could not achieve at a high academic level. The superintendent, in fact, hired an independent group to administer the test to prove that cheating had occurred. Surprise. The retest scores were the same, very high, and as a result of this charge, the Houston superintendent was dismissed. These myth-busting efforts are being replicated through revisions of the initial direct instruction programs and through the implementation work of the National Institute for Direct Instruction, NIFTY, and other groups. However, the initial empirical work to rigorously test the effectiveness of the direct instruction model began with Project Follow-Through in 1968, when the federal government was interested in determining the best way of teaching at-risk children from kindergarten through grade 3. Over 200,000 children in 178 communities were included in the study, and 22 different models of instruction were compared. The communities that implemented the different approaches spanned the full range of demographic variables: geographic distribution and community size, ethnic composition, white, black, Hispanic, Native American, and poverty level, economically disadvantaged and economically advantaged. Parent groups and participating communities selected one approach that they wanted to have implemented, and each school district agreed to implement the approach the parent group selected. Project Follow-Through had strong safeguards to ensure that the participating districts actually implemented the approach they adopted. The government provided stipends to supplement local budgets and support the implementations. It also provided comprehensive health services, including a nutritional component, plus medical and dental care. Evaluation of this large-scale, planned variation, quasi-experimentally designed project occurred in 1977, 9 years after the project began. The results were strong and clear. The follow-through project demonstrated that direct instruction produced the highest levels of achievement in basic skills, cognitive skills, and self-esteem. No other program had results that approached the positive impact of direct instruction. In addition to Project Follow-Through, Doug Carnine and his colleagues conducted a parallel program of rigorous randomized control trials during the same period to examine many of the components and principles of the direct instruction model. In fact, the NIFTY website that's noted there has a 102-page bibliography of the research support for direct instruction, which blew me away. I didn't realize that. Some of this research was prescient. For example, almost 40 years ago, Doug Carnine and Jerry Silbert argued for teaching what they termed at the time the pre-skills for sounding out words in an alphabetic system that they referred to as blending sounds and segmenting. These pre-skills are now nominally known as phonemic awareness skills, which serve as the prerequisite skills critical to word reading and phonological recoding. Thus, for all practical purposes, in the first edition of their book entitled Direct Instruction Reading, published in 1979, Carnine and Silbert unwittingly identified one of the 5 big ideas of beginning reading instruction, phonological awareness, that the National Reading Panel singled out and codified in their research report to Congress in 2000, a little more than 2 decades later. While the results of Project Follow-Through, coupled with the philosophical principles and myth-busting examples, captured how direct instruction questioned, provoked, and clearly challenged the status quo, at the heart of the thread science of direct instruction is a construct that eludes both the adversaries and many advocates of direct instruction, including those who know direct instruction intimately in its classroom applications. And that construct is the design or architecture of instruction. The architecture of instruction and its application to school content represents for me the golden thread of the direct instruction curriculum and programs. This is where Engelmann and his colleagues simply separated themselves from the pack. As the slide indicates, the design of instruction refers to a systematic process of translating principles of learning and instruction into plans for instructional materials and activities, and also involves initially preparing instruction that has a high probability of preventing learner errors and or misconceptions and misrules. For Zig, the teaching mattered because the children mattered, and thus the words, actions, and events contained in a teaching presentation mattered. Like Twain, the right action, the right word represented the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. The curriculum program that teachers use had to be designed in a way that ensured a teaching presentation would move a child from the state of not knowing something to a state to knowing that something more fully and completely, and at a high criterion level of performance or mastery, and as Zig would say, with desperate efficiency. While the status quo perceived the curriculum content, such as reading, math, science, critical thinking, history, as secondary to teacher creativity and freedom, and thus privileged the adult in the teaching equation, Engelmann, in conspicuous contrast, privileged the learner, especially the naive and struggling learner, in that same equation. Engelmann and his collaborators saw the curriculum as key to communicating the content or information, in which that transfer of that information from the teacher to the learner had to ensure the highest probability of success and was developed with no details left to chance so that it prevented learner errors, misconceptions, or misrules. As Russ Whitehurst, the founding director of the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the research, evaluation, and statistical arm of the U.S. Department of Education, by the way, argues, it's the curriculum interventions, stupid, that matter with effect sizes that are 2 to 3 times greater than school governance levers or other levers. This golden thread of the design or architecture of instruction had its theoretical and empirical roots in many literatures. As Zig and Doug write, these roots were discovered first for them and coincidentally in John Stuart Mill's System of Logic in 1843. In addition, these roots can also be found in the experimental psychology literature of the 60s and 70s on concept teaching, as well as the computer science and engineering literature around the same time period known as instruction set architecture. And the lectures on computation and specifically on coding and information theory by Richard Feynman, the 1965 Nobel laureate in physics. These different instruction design research literatures were all related in principle to a single common conceptual and theoretical construct, the design and communication of information, and to information theory. In his book, Grammatical Man, Information on Entropy, Language and Life, Jeremy Campbell traces the origins of information theory to Claude Shannon of Bell Telephone Laboratories and the design of early learning radar systems, color television transmission, and the recovery of intact messages from distant spacecraft. Shannon's primary focus was on the task of separating the probability of the receipt of the target message from noise in the communication. Obviously, this focus is no different than focusing on the probable path of a message communicating in natural space from a teacher to a student. In short, the direct instruction model takes full responsibility for designing the message in a way that makes one message more probable than another message, and certainly more probable than noise. So, that's the way it is. This evening's program is about all the threads we have found in this community, and as Stafford reminds us, while we hold them, we can't get lost. I want to thank Doug Carnine in particular for giving me that thread to hold. Thank you.